Hello, welcome to week 3 of creative writing. Today we are moving on to fiction after our 2 weeks of poetry. We're going to be talking about narration, we're going to talk about character and setting. As always, if you haven't done the readings yet, go back and read them, come back and watch this video. Before we get started talking about all the fiction things I want to talk about today, quick reminders. You have your workshop for fiction due this week, and the instructions for that are in the discussion board, just like with the poetry stuff. You also have your reflection for poetry due this week. Again, the instructions for that are in the assignment, but I just want to really quickly reiterate for that reflection that I would like the reflection to be you taking time to genuinely think about what the process of your writing was for that poem, and talk about either something that you think worked really well and how you can replicate that technique, or something that you think didn't work and how to avoid that technique in the future. Because the reflections are meant to make you think about what techniques you're using and how to think about that consciously, because sometimes what we do when we're writing fiction or poetry is we write something and we either know it's good or bad and we don't know why, but we're just going to be like, well, that was trash, I'm going to throw that away and I'm going to do something different, right? But if you reflect on, okay, I didn't like that, I didn't think that worked, and then think about like why it didn't work and what you can do to avoid the things that you didn't like in the future, it can really help your writing. So that's what I want you to generally do with the reflection. It's super short, so it doesn't have to be a really in-depth thing, but just think about what techniques you used and think about either how to replicate them again or how to avoid them in the future. Okay, so those are your reminders. You have a workshop this week and you have a reflection. So, narration, character, setting. Let's start with narration. Narration, obviously, is who's telling the story that you're creating in your fiction. There's like very basic narration stuff that you are probably aware of, like first, second, and third person. First person would be saying, I did this, I did that. Second person would be saying, you did this. It's a more uncommon form of narration, but of course you see it in Girl, which you read this week. And then third person would be they did this, he did this, she did this, etc. So narration, apart from just like which perspective you're telling it in, whether you're telling it from a like personal perspective or a third person perspective, narration also very much depends on like the style of the person writing it. Now obviously like you are the author, you are the person writing it, but it's fiction, so a lot of times there's another layer. You're the one writing it, but then you're writing it as if a second character was writing it, right? So one thing I want you to think about when you're considering the like narrative voice that you're using in your story is think about the tone. Are you writing it in first person? And if so, how would that person sound speaking or writing? Is it a casual tone? Is it a formal tone? It's not necessarily something you have to decide in the very beginning, but it should definitely be something you're thinking about when you're editing it to make it consistent throughout the story. Be aware of how the narrator sounds and making sure that stays the same, or if it changes, that there's a reason that sound or that the way the narrator is speaking would change. I wanted you to read Girl by Jamaica Kincaid because it's a really, really interesting narration style. It's a very complex narration style. It has multiple layers. So it is, if you read it, it is a list of things, and it's written by this list is was formed by the narrator's mother, but it's being remembered by the narrator, if that makes sense. So it's written in second person saying, you should do this, you should not do this, you need to behave like this, you need to do these things. But that you is referring to the narrator. So it's the narrator remembering all the things that her mother said to her, right? So when you're creating a narrator and a narrative voice, it can be multi-layered like that. It can be someone remembering something someone else said, and then you have different voices conflicting with each other, and it can make your narration more complicated and more complex. The other thing we want to talk about is character. So there are different ways to form a story, and when you're forming kind of the structure of the story, a lot of the times something you'll want to decide is if you're doing a character-based plot or character-based storytelling or a plot-based storytelling. So character-based storytelling is more common in like literary fiction, although it's super common in genre fiction these days too. That's a whole other thing. But the divide between literary fiction and genre fiction is not, there's really no divide. It's very fluid. But character-based storytelling tends to be more focused on either the inner world of the character or their relationship with other characters if you have one main character, which can be difficult if you're talking about development, character development, in a short story, because it's hard to give someone satisfying development in, you know, a page or 5 pages or even 20 pages, you know? So you might not have that traditional like character arc, character development that you have in a lot of novels where it's like, this character learns how to be a better person by the end of the story, or this character learns something about themselves by the end of the story. You can have that, but a lot of times it's more difficult to have a really in-depth development in a short story. So a lot of times the focus tends to be on a particular aspect of the character's personality and diving into that, or their relationship with other people. Like when we read Out of Skin by Emily Carroll, which was a like graphic storytelling, right? That focused on like the particular aspects of the character's fear and how that fear relates to other people and their family and stuff like that. So that character didn't necessarily have a character arc. There was no necessary development in the main character in Carol's story in Out of Skin, but there was still the in-depth discovery of what that character feared and what how those fears develop and stuff. So when we're talking about characters, a lot of the things that tend to come up are stuff like archetypes. And archetypes can be very useful to understand how we're developing characters, but you never want to stop at an archetype, right? Archetypes are actually a really common thing to use in plot-based storytelling. So where the characters don't matter as much as what events are unfolding, and so the characters end up being like placeholders. Excuse me. So this is very common in like murder mysteries is a simple example of where the plot is way more important than the character. So if you've ever read like Agatha Christie stories, right? I'm forgetting the main character. Agatha Christie. Poirot, yes. Poirot does not develop as a person, right? He stays exactly the same the entire billion books that Agatha Christie wrote about him, right? He does not change as a person. But that's not the point. The point is to solve these mysteries. So you can have stories that are much more focused on the plot in the events than the actual characters, and the characters end up being just something to keep the plot moving, right? So that's another way of going about storytelling. So with setting, I want to lastly talk about setting. Obviously, I gave you the reading of excerpts of Invisible Cities to talk about settings, because Invisible Cities is 90% setting, right? It's much more about setting than it's actually about characters. But setting is a really, really good way to establish things in a story. So, like, the setting in Invisible Cities ends up being more of a character of its own than the actual people in the stories, which is an actually really interesting technique, is when the setting feels so alive, the geography feels so alive, where the people are feels so integral to the story that it's almost its own character. This also kind of happens in Out of Skin, where like the forest and the trees and stuff is a little bit sentient, a little bit alive. It's a super common thing in horror fiction, like Out of Skin is, where like the house is a little bit sentient or has a little bit of its own like autonomy, which can be a really interesting way to explore the background. And setting can be a kind of more fill in the background type of thing to make the thing you're focusing on, the characters of the plot, more vibrant, more real feeling. That can be the purpose of setting, is just to create kind of a tapestry. But a setting can also be something really integral to the story, like in Invisible Cities, or if the like geography of the place or the region is super important to the culture. And so if the cultural implications of a story is a really big plot point or character point, then the setting will need to be like very clear and very prominent. So when you're writing your short story, I want you to be deciding how important the setting is. Is it something just like a nice canvas background to create some vibrancy and to push the focus towards your character or your plot? Or is it something really, really integral that you very much want to focus on due to, like the culture that comes from that setting or something like that? Okay, so that's pretty much all I have for this week. Again, when you're responding to your prompts, which I gave you a couple of, you can choose whichever one you want. I want you to be thinking about how you're narrating, who your narrator is, what their voice sounds like. I want you to be thinking about the character or the many characters that you may have, what their kind of inner thoughts are, inner world. Think about whether you want it to be a more character-based story or a more plot-based story, which is more important. And then also be thinking about setting and all those things I just talked about there. Okay, so as always, email or text me if you have any questions. I'll be happy to answer them, and I'll see you all next week.